Welcome back to Navigating Health with Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander Communities, a learning course with the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. My name is Alisi Tulua, and this is Module 3, Historical Context. I hope that you've had an opportunity to take a look at the first two modules. The most recent one, I touched on common cultural values and health beliefs across Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities in the U.S. In this module, I will be talking about the historical context that lends itself to the different health outcomes that we see in the population today. I'll be discussing the impact of U.S. colonialism on Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders, and we'll also situate Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander health disparities within this historical context. I hope to achieve these two objectives. Number one is to develop knowledge of relationships between the U.S. and the Pacific Islands, and to increase understanding of the influences of history on health outcomes of Pacific Islanders. A really good place to start this conversation is maybe this larger understanding of the different kinds of relationships that exist between the United States and some of our different Pacific islands. The title of this map, of this slide, is Why Immigration is Relevant to Pacific Islanders. And I'll talk about this in a little bit. But this wonderful graphic is from the A Community of Contrast report, which was developed by Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, EPIC, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles. This looks at Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders in the United States. And it was developed in 2014, utilizing largely census data from 2010. However, they developed this really great graphic that sums up, that provides a summary of the different relationships and the different designations provided to different parts of the Pacific Islands. And this is a really important place to have this conversation about the historical context that contributes to the health outcomes in our communities, because we are not all immigrants of the same degree. And the differences in that comes from the different histories that many of our different islands have with the US, and not just with the US, but the different countries that had colonized the different parts of the Pacific, and how ultimately many of these current relationships exist today between the US and the Pacific. And just to provide a quick summary of this graphic, you can see here the different groupings of different, I guess, for lack of a better word, immigration designation or immigrant status that is provided to different parts of our communities. And just to clarify, all of the Pacific Islands are immigrants to the U.S., except Hawaii is not. They are not. Native Hawaiians are not immigrants because they belong on Hawaii, which is the 50th state of the U.S., and they have never had to immigrate anywhere or migrate anywhere. That is their land. So the rest of us, with regards to the U.S., are immigrants. If we are migrating to the continental U.S., however, some of our islands are territories or are common, part of the U.S. in other ways, and so some of them have remained on island and have a relationship with the U.S. So already, I feel like it sounds complicated already, but it is complicated, and I hope to provide a little bit of clarity through this presentation. What I'm going to be doing is I'll go through each of these designations, and I'll talk a little bit more about the countries that fall under each of those designations and the different characteristics or allowances that fall under that designation that is allowed for the groups or the people that come from those islands. I hope that makes sense. So the different designations that you see here are U.S. citizens, those that belong under the Compact of Free Association, U.S. nationals, and immigrants. So we'll start with U.S. citizens. So as you can see here, U.S. citizens are those that are from Hawaii, which is a state, Guam, which is a territory, or from the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, which is a Commonwealth of the U.S. We'll just start with Hawaii as a state. The indigenous people of Hawaii are, of course, the Native Hawaiians, and the U.S. became a state in I'm going to refer to my notes so I don't get anything wrong. In 1959, however, it came under the possession of the United States through the illegal overthrow of its monarchy in 1893 by U.S. businessmen. And there are many conversations happening in Hawaii within the Native Hawaiian community that I cannot speak to, as I am not Native Hawaiian. But I will for sure be providing some videos that provide better context to especially how health has been impacted for Native Hawaiians. And so hopefully you'll be able to watch that in combination with this module to provide more and better context from Native Hawaiian leaders themselves. But if you are born on Hawaii, and of course those that are Native Hawaiian are automatically U.S. citizens. And Hawaii, of course, functions as a state, as like any other state in this country. Those that are from Guam, Guam is a U.S. territory, but those that are born on Guam are automatic U.S. citizens. And Guam also has a history of colonization, beginning with the Spanish. They were colonized by Spain for centuries, many years and generations, and changed hands to the U.S. after the Spanish-American War. And for a few years there, during World War II, Japan then took over Guam and then ceded Guam to the U.S. again soon after World War II. And so many of those changes, obviously, because Guam is a very strategic place in the Pacific for war and military. And so it has changed hands because of war and military occupation. So let's see. In 1950, under the Guam Organic Act, this was the act that provided birthright citizenship to those that are from Guam. The indigenous people of Guam are the Chamorro people. The Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, also known as CNMI, they have it is a Commonwealth of the U.S. and so, but they have birthright citizenship also. CNMI has a similar history as Guam, except that in 1898, Spain sold CNMI to Germany. So that's where CNMI and Guam diverged in history. And so the Spanish sold CNMI to Germany and didn't sell Guam. So then it ended up on its own course of history. But of course, through World War I and World War II, there were many different bloody wars that has impacted the area. And so in 1945, when the Japanese surrendered at the end of World War II, the U.S. Navy administered care over CNMI and handed it over to the UN as part of the Trust Territories of the Pacific Islands. And then in 1975, the Northern Mariana Islands voted to become part of the American political family and established itself as a Commonwealth territory. And so CNMI actually has as of 2009, it has a House of Representative delegate in the U.S. Congress who do not have a vote on the floor, but however can participate and vote in committees. So Right. So I forgot to mention that same thing about Guam. Guam also has a House of Representative delegate in Congress who do not have a vote on the floor, but can have vote in committee and can participate in those capacities. The indigenous people of CNMI are, of course, Chamorros and also Carolinians. So the characteristics that fall under those that are U.S. citizens is that they can live and work in the U.S. legally. They qualify for public benefits the same way that other citizens do. They can vote in elections, of course, and are eligible to serve in the U.S. military. So I'm going to go back to the voting part. You can vote in elections if you're on the continental U.S. So if you are from Guam or CNMI, although you are citizens, you have to be on the continental U.S. soil in order to vote for president. However, those that live on island can vote for governor and their House of Representative delegate. So, all right. I hope that gives you an idea of some of the complexity, even within this one category of U.S. citizenship, and the complexity that the different histories that our different islands experience contribute to even the way that they have access to voting, even how they can access public benefits are also very different, even though they are U.S. citizens. All right, the next designation that I'll talk about is those that fall under the Compact of Free Association. And so as you can see here, this includes those that are from the Republic of Palau, the Republic of Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. And the Federated States of Micronesia includes these 4 different states, Yap, Chuuk, Pohnpei, and Kosrae. So as you can imagine, this compact has its own historical journey that is as complicated as those that I've explained for Guam and CNMI, and the different hands that it has gone through in terms of the different countries that have had power over many of these islands. Ultimately, where we are today is that the compact has been drafted for these countries for them to be under the protection and assistance of the United States, which then allows the U.S. uninhibited access to land and waterways and for strategic purposes. And so these 3 different nations have had their own relationships with the U.S. In particular, the Republic of Marshall Islands was utilized in the late 40s and early 50s for atomic bomb testing. And so many of the elements of the compact takes into account the ways that the U.S. and specifically the U.S. military has utilized some of the islands and some of the waters around these islands for military purposes. Let's see. The current compact between these, we refer to them as COFA, between these COFA nations and the U.S. Are constantly having to be renewed and constantly having to be negotiated. The Palau and so the Federated States of Micronesia and the Republic of the Marshall Islands, their compact currently runs through 2023, and then Palau's compact runs through 2024. And so if you fall under this group, you have access to live and work in the U.S. legally. You are labeled a non-immigrant, but you are neither a citizen or a national, but you don't fall under what we generally understand as immigrants. And so it creates, there's a complexity in that in itself, because of that non-immigrant designation. Many state agencies, many federal agencies don't always know what that is, and so then there's a lot of difficulty in navigating systems when it comes to our COFA communities. Most that are from our COFA communities are not eligible for most federal benefits unless they are covered under states' benefits. So that means individual states have to elect to provide services and to provide benefits to our COFA communities. Those that are under COFA designation are eligible to serve in the U.S. military. Let's see. I wanted to spend a little bit of time here. So, as I said, a lot of policies that are written in general for the U.S. don't always take into account the ways that it impacts these different parts of the population. And so back in 1996, under the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, those that fall under the COFA community were stripped of any eligibility for most federal benefits. And so with regards to health, when the discussions around the Affordable Care Act was happening, there were a lot of community organizations that advocated for their inclusion or for them to be restored back into being able to access public benefits, and that wasn't successful. And so it has become part of the COFA community's work, as well as the larger Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander work to advocate for coverage in public benefits for this population. And so one of the most recent successes in this work is the restoration of Medicaid for our COFA communities, which just took place, which just passed in December 21st, 2020, under COVID relief bill, to be able to provide access to healthcare for this community because of the impact of COVID that was having on this population. All right, the next group is those that fall under U.S. nationals. And so looking at this more closely, even though Guam is also a U.S. territory, like American Samoa is a U.S. territory, those that are from Guam are citizens, and those that are in American Samoa are U.S. nationals. And if you're a U.S. national, you can live and work in the U.S. legally. And similar to other immigrants, you must obtain citizenship in order to have access to full benefits, public benefits. And this also, I'll talk about that in a little bit. You qualify for most federal benefits in some states, or local benefits, depending on where you live. You cannot vote when living in the states, and you are eligible to serve in the U.S. military. So with regards to voting, in order for you to vote, in U.S. elections, you have to go through the naturalization process to become a citizen in order for you to vote. However, if you're in American Samoa, you can vote for the local officials, and so American Samoa also has a House of Representative delegate that does not vote on the floor in Congress, but can vote in committee and participate in those capacities. Another key part that I wanted to mention is many of the islands that fall under some kind of formal relationship with the U.S. So in this case, American Samoa being U.S. nationals, those that are part of the COFA community, and also those that are citizens under that are from Guam or CNMI. A lot of those Pacific Islands have really high participation in the military. Many of those islands also have military bases on them. And so there's a lot of military presence in many of these places. last but not least is the rest of everybody else who fall under immigrants, the way that we understand immigrants in this country. So if you don't fall under any of those other designations or countries, then you are you fall under immigrants, and you go through the immigration process the same way anybody else does. And so the rest of the islands that belong under here are, some that are listed here. I should have listed Fiji here because there's a large Fijian community that is in the US, but many of those people have to go through, filling out your immigration papers, going through that process, having to live in the US for 5 years before applying for public benefits or before applying for citizenship. So you're neither citizens nor nationals. You must apply for legal permanent resident status to work and live in the US legally. Similar to other immigrants, you must wait 5 years to apply for public benefits, and you cannot vote or serve in the US military unless you become a US citizen. So one of the key things to raise here is if you fall under this group, many of the communities that are part of this group also has large undocumented populations, because many come here with visitation visas and often overstay and lose their legal status as a visitor and end up just living here for decades without ever going through the immigration process. And so this is a part of our Pacific Island community that is not always visible, those that are undocumented. And so when we're talking about undocumented issues, it absolutely applies to the Pacific Islander community, those that fall under this designation. So given everything that I've shared here, I hope that you were able to understand some of the differences based on the relationships that some of our different groups have with the US. But more than that, I hope that it helps you think about the histories that many of our different populations have gone through to arrive at these designations. And many of these histories include clearly colonization, militarization, that have forced different things such as disruption and destruction of land, and the traditional structures that existed in indigenous society. And this kind of disruption to the kinds of structures that existed before colonization also means that there's a lot of loss of different kinds of traditional practices that are self-sustaining, that helps with the environment, and also just contributes to individual practices in things such as what people eat or how they live their lives day to day. The other really big impact is because of these different occupations and colonizations, there has been a lot of displacement of people from the land that had belonged to generations and generations of their ancestors. And this kind of displacement also means a disconnection from the practices that are rooted in the lands that people have grown up in. And, I'm sure that as I'm talking about displacement, people might think, well, that happened generations ago, but there are still populations that are being displaced today. As I'm sharing, there's a current fight going on in Guam with some of the populations there that are being displaced from their lands for the expansion of the military base there. So the story of displacement has been happening for decades, hundreds of years. In fact, it's still happening today. And that kind of displacement contributes to loss of identity, loss of family structure, which really impacts the way that people live their lives. With a lot of the shifts and the changes also has contributed to a change in the lifestyle. And so the very clear implication of this is what you see in terms of diet and what people eat. It has moved from a lifestyle of growing your own food and eating off the land to a lifestyle of eating what's convenient, and in most times what's convenient is what is being imported from overseas and what you can buy in the store, and often more times than none, those are the unhealthier options when it comes to food that people have to eat on the islands. And so I'm talking about what's happening on the island, but that also carries over to the populations that are here. And then last but not least, one of the greatest impact is there's this dependence on imported infrastructure. And so rather than people relying or having a more healthy diet that leads to healthier health outcomes, and an unhealthier diet leads to chronic diseases that depend on medical systems and medical infrastructure that does not exist on the islands. And so then, people have to move to seek healthcare. One really clear example is because of the nuclear bomb testing that was taking place in the Marshall Islands, and many of the populations there have been impacted, are still impacted by radiation. And because there is a lack of medical infrastructure on the islands to take care of those people, they have to move entire families somewhere where they can access healthcare. And so there are a lot of levels of disruption in a lot of different levels of displacement. And so many of those kinds of things have really large impact on the ways that people live their day-to-day lives and the kinds of health outcomes that result from that. So I hope that you're able to think about based on what I had presented before, of the different levels of colonization and military occupation that happened over centuries of the histories of our Pacific Islands, how those things can still greatly impact the health and the health outcomes in the populations, even the populations that have moved here to the United States. I think another really good example is what you see happening with the Native Hawaiian population in Hawaii and the kind of health outcomes that you're seeing there. And as I shared, I will be, providing some links to other videos that go into those health outcomes more specifically. But, the Native Hawaiian population in Hawaii are the most displaced and have the highest rates of houselessness. And, you can imagine that the histories of disruption and destruction of culture and displacement has contributed to what we're seeing in the Native Hawaiian population in Hawaii today. And so because of that history, there are many complexities that gets raised in the work that we're doing around health advocacy for our communities. And some of them I've been able to capture here, but there are many others. So I just want to touch on these. So number one is, the label in HPI is not a monolith. As you can see, we have, depending on where you come from, there are different relationships with the United States, which allow for different access points to healthcare and benefits, which allows for different points of empowerment in terms of whether you can vote for the people that make decisions for your life every day. And so all of our experiences are varied. They're all different. And some of them are different because of the histories that our populations have with the US. Second point is, because of that, access to quality healthcare is different depending on where you come from. I don't think I need to go into this even more, but I'm sure that you've been able to pinpoint how that varies across our different communities. That means that for our work, advocacy must be very specific. So if we're advocating for one population, we need to be able to understand the kinds of policies that are impacting their current status and what our advocacy needs to look like as a community. And last but not least, strategies must be inclusive, because many of our communities, if we are driving strategies individually, it's hard because we're smaller. But if we are able to include the different ways that we can advocate for different parts of our community within one strategy, then we're able to push at many different levels. And so we, as community organizations, and we're developing our work, we have to think about the different parts of our community that we need to include in order for all of us to be visible in this work. So I hope that you've been able to learn a little bit from what I've shared here. And in particular, I hope that you've been able to have a little bit more context about some of the complexities that exist across our different communities because of the different relationships that our different populations have with the US. So I'm gonna go into our knowledge check. Knowledge check number 1, which is not a current designation for any of the Pacific Island nations in the US. Number 1, or A, statehood. B, trust territories of the Pacific Islands. C, compact of free association. And D, nationals. Which is not currently a designation. The answer is B, trust territories of the Pacific Islands. So this existed historically and grouped some of our islands together, but many of those have fallen under different designations now. Number 2, what benefit was restored for COFA migrants on December 21st, 2020? SNAP, WIC, Medicaid, or FEMA benefits? C, Medicaid. This was a huge win for our communities. However, there are many other benefits that our COFA migrants do not have access to that we continue to work around. 3, displacing people from their ancestral land can have devastating effects on their health. True or false? I hope that you are able to remember that is a true statement. As I shared before, many of the, I shared 4 main ways that these larger historical events and the historical context has affected the health outcomes of our communities. Displacement from their land is one of those. And so with that, I hope that you have been able to learn a little bit more about the things that have impacted the health outcomes in our Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community. And I hope to see you in module number 4. Bye. Oh, I guess I'm not saying bye yet. So to close out, I just want to say thank you for joining us, and I'll close out with this really important quote from one of our most prominent warriors who just passed on last week on July 3rd, 2021. This is Dr. Haunani K. Trask, who's a Native Hawaiian staunch, fierce leader. And she says, cultural people have to become political. It's not just that political people like myself have to become cultural. Our culture can't just be ornamental and recreational. Our culture has to be at the core of our mana. That's what culture is for. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.